Charlie Kirk's rather ironic fate is part of an apparent trend that has spurred conversation around the role of unfriendly physical force in politics. Beyond one just having a role in the other, the two are actually much more intimate. Both are inseparable in relation to class struggle. It is a false understanding of this that leads some to mistakenly believe that every confrontation is revolutionary. These same events prompt a very different response from legacy media outlets, who release statements about what is and isn't acceptable. Unfortunately for them, history presents a different picture, one where even the freest of states willingly use force to suppress workers. In light of this, there comes a point when the condition of the working class can only be improved through a similar use of force, either in reality or only potentially. Try as they may to discredit this reality, the bourgeoisie validates it through their historic actions. However true this may all be, it is only when class conflict peaks that such action becomes historically possible. Using it prematurely can be disastrous for the working class movement, one of the many reasons it is wrong to act as Tyler Robinson did. It is important to clarify that terrorism is completely counterproductive and stupid. When using this term, we are strictly referring to singular acts of violence similar to those listed by Trotsky in Why Marxists Oppose Terrorism.
The killing of an employer, a threat to set fire to a factory, or a death threat to its owner, an assassination attempt with revolver in hand against a government minister. All these are terrorist acts in the full and authentic sense.
Throughout the history of proletarian struggle, individuals and groups have engaged in these sorts of activities in an attempt to overthrow capitalism or combat aspects of it. All of these instances resulted in failure due to problems inherent to the method. Terrorists fail to understand that the economic reconstruction of society can only be accomplished through mass action. Consequently, they developed the foolish belief that individuals can force change through destructive defiance. This conception views workers as the object of revolution and clandestine revolutionaries as the subject. Since these acts must be planned in absolute secrecy, they make it impossible to engage in the only activity that can actually bring about societal change, forming and maintaining contacts with the working class in order to mobilize them. Beyond just preventing this work, terrorism actively hinders mass organization by leaving workers passive as they anticipate the next attack. Worse yet, they give the state an excuse to crack down on existing organizations, potentially leaving the working class too weak to seize power if an opportunity should arise. All these reasons, which we have previously covered in further depth, make terrorism an ineffective method of struggle. Just look at Luigi, who failed to leave any impact on the American healthcare system, something emphasized by measures taken against Medicare and Medicaid, which have only worsened it in the time since. News outlets often react to political violence by saying it has no place in liberal democracy, a claim that may appear reasonable but is entirely unfounded. It can generally be acknowledged that liberal democracy is a form of state, meaning it is a power elevated above and exerting authority over society. It is only able to do this because power is not held by the population itself, but by specialized institutions like the military and police. With these special bodies of armed men at its disposal, liberal democracy has exclusive access to disciplinary authority and lethal force within society, allowing it to maintain domination over society. There can be no doubt that this is an inherently violent dynamic, as acknowledged by the standard sociological description of the state as having a monopoly on violence. Defenders of liberal democracy may say that it wields this monopoly for the citizenry rather than against it, with majority rule allowing society as a whole to use it for the greater good. This sounds like a robust argument until classes are considered. When describing liberal democracy in his 1884 work, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and States, Engels writes,
"Wealth here employs its power indirectly, but all the more surely. It does this in two ways, by plain corruption of officials, of which America is the classic example, and by an alliance between the government and the stock exchange, which is effected all the more easily the higher the state debt mounts, and the more the joint stock companies concentrate in their hands not only transport, but also production itself, and themselves have their own center in the stock exchange."
This wealth belongs to none other than the capitalist class, whose presence is seen in state composition and legislation regardless of which political party is in power, effectively granting them political supremacy. If the violence monopolized by liberal democracy is used to uphold the political supremacy of the capitalist class, then what is it if not political violence? To say it has no place in liberal democracy is therefore absurd, as it is in fact the very order liberal democracy stands upon. Adding insult to injury, those who claim otherwise defend the state's violence, such as when certain outlets cried about how impeding order is unacceptable after an ICE raid met resistance in mid-2025. Order here is the state's right to kidnap some of the most marginalized members of the working class. In doing so, migrant labor is made more exploitable by deterring any desire of the illegal worker to demand more, a process which drives down the wages and working conditions of the American workers who are forced to compete with their fellow men. Through such actions, liberal democracy reveals itself to be nothing but an apparatus that maintains bourgeois domination. With the authority vested to it by violence, the bourgeois state legitimizes and ensures the exploitation of the masses required by the capitalist mode of production. Under capitalism, commodified labor power is employed in generalized commodity production, through which surplus value is produced and used for capital accumulation. Let's break that down. In exchange for a wage, workers sell their labor power to firms that use it to produce commodities, useful goods or services intended for sale. These commodities embody more value than the value of the labor power that produced them. The excess, surplus value, goes to the firm as profit, a portion of which is reinvested to expand production and enable the extraction of further surplus value. Workers have no choice but to enter this dynamic, since, as Engels stated in The Condition of the Working Class in England,
the bourgeoisie has gained a monopoly of all means of existence in the broadest sense of the word. What the proletarian needs, he can obtain only from this bourgeoisie, which is protected in its monopoly by the power of the state.
Capital expanded its sphere of domination over labor through the disposition of small and communal producers. It constantly reproduces this divorce by way of ownership of means of production and the production of the fruits of labor for exchange, whether they are owned by individual capitalists, a board, or the state. By enforcing property rights, the state allows the bourgeoisie, or itself, to control all the means of production, leaving workers with nothing but their own labor power which they must sell to afford the basic requirements of life. This dynamic comes with a conflict of interest. Capitalist competition incentivizes the firm to extract more surplus value from the worker through several methods. The capitalist can directly decrease wages or extend the working day without compensation. Capitalists can also reduce the necessary labor time, the portion of the day in which the worker produces value equal to their wages, to increase surplus labor time, the portion of the day in which the worker produces value for the capitalist. Although the worker does have an equal interest in higher wages and more free time, they are in less of a position than the capitalist to advance said interests. Capitalists have access to a reserve army of labor that can be drawn from to replace the worker, who is taught by the state's actions to fear unemployment. As Engels stated in the aforementioned work,
when these people find no work and will not rebel against society, what remains for them but to beg? And surely no one can wonder at the great army of beggars, most of them able-bodied men, with whom the police carries on perpetual war.
Besides harassing the homeless for simply existing, the state punishes those who dare steal out of desperation, only to neglect others who starve while pointing at programs that are insufficient without a job. Whether consciously or not, people fear this outcome, leading most to hold on to their positions for dear life. This is one of the many factors that generally allow capitalists to succeed in implementing measures to extract more surplus value. Just as it upholds the exploitation of the working class, the bourgeois state resists the only means by which workers can contest this fate. In the interest of capital, liberal democracy actively hinders attempts from the proletariat to improve their condition, even if it must use force to do so. By organizing, workers overcome some of the advantages that the firm has over them. A lone worker is expendable, comprising but one part of production that can be easily replaced. By coming together, workers can represent a larger part of the production process, making them much harder to replace without halting production. Using this advantage, workers can advance their interests by threatening to or actually stopping work. The capitalist class, however, does not take kindly to this. As Engels noted in The Condition of the Working Class in England,
The bourgeoisie defends its interests with all the power placed at its disposal by wealth and the might of the state. In proportion as the working man determines to alter the present state of things, the bourgeois becomes his avowed enemy.
Capitalists have a wide array of methods by which to prevent workers from organizing and striking. While not all are violent, all are but a few steps away from violence. Propaganda, legal hurdles, and a lack of class consciousness among the workers can only go so far as declining conditions demand action, in which case they organize and strike. If the capitalist wants to end the stoppage, the state is inclined to assist in threatening and suppressing workers. It would be naive to assume this measure is reserved for only the most radical of demands, considering workers spent decades being brutalized in pursuit of labor standards that are now considered commonplace. In America alone, events like the 1877 Great Railroad Strike, the Homestead Strike of 1892, and the Ludlow Strike of 1914, to name a few, were all brutally suppressed with state assistance. Many of the demands workers fought for in these incidents were not recognized by the American state until legislation like the 1935 National Labor Relations Act and 1938 Fair Labor Relations Act was passed. Although they had already been gained by workers in workplaces across the country using extra-legal means. Coincidentally, the first of these acts was legislated roughly a year after a series of strike waves which produced the second largest strike in American history. Through similar experiences, workers all over the world have learned what the June Days taught the Paris proletariat, who hoped to advance their interests within the new bourgeois republic. Marx documented this lesson in his 1850 work Class Struggles in France, stating that the June Days showed the proletariat that
the slightest improvement in its position remains a utopia within the bourgeois republic, a utopia that becomes a crime as soon as it wants to become a reality.
Reforms may seem to contradict this, but they are only wrested from the bourgeoisie using the leverage the proletariat gains as it grows stronger. These concessions are ultimately insufficient as they do not address the underlying fatal mechanisms of capitalism, meaning workers must go beyond them. At a certain point of development, the proletariat must use its culminated strength to seize power in pursuit of interests that are incompatible with the contradictions inherent to the capitalist mode of production. Focusing production around the extraction of surplus value for capital accumulation comes with devastating consequences. Commodities are produced to be sold and keep being produced as they sell, but their production eventually outpaces the market, leading to overproduction and a crisis as the products can't be sold. On top of this, to extract more surplus value, the firm is incentivized to increasingly refine the production process through new, more sophisticated machinery. These raise the organic composition of capital, which ultimately drives down profit in the long run, necessitating a constant expansion of markets to compensate. Together, these two contradictions produce crises that wreak havoc upon society, directly intensifying class conflict in the process. As long as the current mode of production remains intact, there will come moments where workers are compelled to take control of production upon recognizing the destructive impact it has on them. Nothing demonstrates this better than the conflict pursued in an attempt to postpone crisis by exporting capital and seeking out new markets, inevitably culminating in global conflict once capitalist economies have nowhere to expand but into each other. It was at such a moment that Lenin noted the following:
"In all countries, a spirit of rebellion against the capitalist class is growing among the masses, and the proletariat is becoming aware that only the transfer of power to the proletariat and the abolition of private ownership of the means of production can save humanity from ruin."
Today, ruin holds more weight than ever before, as the climate crisis induced by capitalist production develops alongside rising global tensions, making it all the more important for workers to seize the means of production. By doing this, workers begin transforming them into productive forces consciously directed by society as a whole for society as a whole, ending their subordination to capital accumulation and the crisis it repeatedly generates. In such a system, goods are no longer produced to be sold but are distributed according to social need, losing their character as commodities and breaking the conditions that lead to overproduction. Of course, this is fundamentally incompatible with capitalism, meaning the state which upholds it will resist all attempts from workers to seize the means of production, forcing the proletariat to use force if it is to succeed. Any attempt from capitalists to deny this reality only exposes them to be shameless hypocrites. While the capitalist class invokes morality and civility at the slightest implication that the current economic order must be overthrown, their historical actions suggest these pleas are made in bad faith. The modern world did not spontaneously appear. No, it was the result of economic changes developing over time, which eventually exploded to the surface through a series of revolutions and ensuing conflicts. Force was a necessary part of this process, clearing the grounds for capitalism to expand throughout the world. In countries like the Netherlands, England, the United States, and France, the capitalist class seized power and used it to shape the world we know today. When comparing this reality to the bourgeoisie's insistence of peaceful systemic change in his 1895 Introduction to Class Struggles in France, Engels stated,
These anti-overthrow fanatics of today, are they not themselves the overthrowers of yesterday? Have we perchance evoked the Civil War of 1866? Have we driven the King of Hanover, the Elector of Hesse, and the Duke of Nassau from their hereditary lawful domains, and annexed these hereditary domains? And these overthrowers of the German Confederation and 3 crowns by the grace of God complain of overthrow. Quis tolerit Gracchus de seditione querentes? Who could allow the Bismarck worshippers to rail at overthrow?
Bismarck helped orchestrate the forceful unification of Germany that resulted in the German Empire, a move that largely benefited German capitalists and is responsible for the Germany of today. Although proceeding from a failed revolution, this process was largely analogous to the development of other capitalist powers. When it served them, a struggle to destroy the previous order through force was acceptable, but when it comes to the interests of the masses, it must only be done peacefully through legal means. This glaring hypocrisy is further shown by the capitalist response to workers taking charge of society. As Marx stated in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte,
The civilization and justice of bourgeois order comes out in its lurid light whenever the slaves and drudges of that order rise against their masters. Then this civilization and justice stand forth as undistinguished savagery and lawless revenge.
In these instances, there is no bounds to the brutality the bourgeoisie is willing to engage in to re-establish their order, regardless of the morality and civility displayed by workers. For example, the 1918 German Revolution developed entirely organically with little resistance from the masses. As workers' and soldiers' councils were established throughout the country, old officials were left unpunished. In contrast, the counter-revolution was slow, methodical, and forced. Unforgiving punishment was used to re-establish order by the very same officials the workers had left unscathed. Workers have met a similar response everywhere they have attempted or even just had the capacity to attempt to lead society, showing that capitalists will never willingly step down. These events make it clear that the proletariat can only take control of the means of production through force, the ultimate combination of which is the dictatorship of the proletariat. While force is the only way to restructure society, a state is necessary to hone and direct it. By establishing one, the proletariat disempowers the bourgeoisie and legitimizes its own authority, which it uses to suppress capitalist resistance to the economic transformation of society. For this reason, Marx stated the following in Critique of the Gotha Program.
Between capitalist and communist society lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of the one into the other. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat.
Workers can't just repurpose the current state as it is specifically designed to serve the capitalist class. Instead, it must be destroyed and replaced by an entirely new apparatus consisting of institutions that maintain and expand proletarian rule. With this state, the proletariat is able to guard against reaction, wrest control of the means of production from the capitalist class, and draw the masses into economic management of society. As such, when documenting the first historical instance of proletarian dictatorship in his work, The Civil War in France, Marx wrote,
Yes, gentlemen, the Commune intended to abolish that class property which makes the labor of the many the wealth of the few. It aimed at the expropriation of the expropriators. It wanted to make individual property a truth by transforming the means of production, land and capital, now chiefly the means of enslaving and exploiting labor, into mere instruments of free and associated labor.
As this process advances, the bourgeoisie disappears and productive labor is universalized, meaning classes gradually cease to exist. Simultaneously, the state, with class as its basis, loses its character as a state, since it is no longer a power held over society for the political domination of one class. Of course, for any of this to be possible, the existing state must be destroyed and replaced with the worker state. This can only be done through an armed uprising. Launching the attack to consolidate proletarian rule requires careful timing and consideration, activity that is only possible with a revolutionary party. In Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany, Engels explains this, stating,
Insurrection is an art quite as much as war or any other, and subject to certain rules of proceeding, which, when neglected, will produce the ruin of the party neglecting them. Firstly, never play with insurrection unless you are fully prepared to face the consequences of your play. Insurrection is a calculus with very indefinite magnitudes, the value of which may change every day. The forces opposed to you have all the advantage of organization, discipline, and habitual authority. Unless you bring strong odds against them, you are defeated and ruined. Secondly, the insurrectionary career, once entered upon, act with the greatest determination and on the offensive.
The historical experience of the Russian Revolution demonstrates the importance of these rules. Various factors were considered before the Bolsheviks seized power, all of which served to maximize the odds of successful insurrection. Gaining a majority within key Soviets allowed the Bolsheviks to mobilize the proletariat when a revolutionary upsurge swept the nation and the ruling class was in a compromised position. Upon doing so, workers and soldiers advanced decisively and swiftly, overthrowing the provisional government with little struggle over the course of a few days, establishing the state power that was used in the civil war that followed. All of this was only possible because a revolutionary situation existed, meaning the bourgeoisie was in a crisis that prevented it from maintaining power through traditional means, the suffering and want of the masses was particularly acute, and mass activity peaked due to these two factors. The Bolsheviks were able to recognize a revolutionary situation and engage in activity to ensure a revolution successfully came of it. In doing this, the Bolsheviks alone did not create an uprising. The conditions for it were already there and it was going to come with or without them. They merely ensured that the uprising succeeded. Political violence is clearly an inherent part of class struggle, as demonstrated at every stage of its development. Capitalism maintains a hold over society through the force embodied by states such as liberal democracy, which serve to uphold conditions required by the capitalist mode of production that simultaneously keep the masses in a state of exploitation necessary for capital accumulation. Whenever workers attempt to improve upon this condition, the state willingly uses force to thwart these attempts in the interests of capital. Capitalism inevitably produces situations in which the proletariat can only alleviate its suffering by destroying capitalism itself, a task that requires the overthrow of the state that upholds it. In its place, a new state must be installed and used by workers to dismantle the current mode of production. Displacing the old bourgeois apparatus with the new proletarian one requires an uprising that can only succeed under specific conditions. All of the violence present in this dynamic is political, as it serves political power directly, whether in the interest of the capitalist class that already holds it, or the working class which must secure it.